Welcome to Animate Earth. We are here tonight to talk about subtle energies of the land. We are with you for an hour and we will be speaking for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open up for 20 minutes to hear some of your voices and questions. If you could all make sure you're on mute, that would be wonderful, please. And you're very welcome to use the chat, but we won't be able to monitor it until we open up for questions. So if you have questions that you'd love to have seen, then please wait for that moment. Brilliant. Well, we are here tonight with Dr. Patrick MacManaway. Hi, Patrick. Thank you for joining us. Patrick is otherwise known as the Land Whisperer, and we're really excited to have him here tonight. He is a third-generation practitioner of psychic and healing arts and works with farmers and land stewards, organisations and people all over the world to bring grace and to restore balance in natural systems through energy work. He is a past president of the British Dowsing Society and has a degree in medicine. And he's also undertaken apprenticeships in Western and Eastern geomancy and working with landscape energy. So as ever, we are very interested in the land and our conversation with the land here at Animate Earth. So it's an absolute delight to have him here tonight. Patrick, I have called your work energy work there, but I'd really love to hear from you how you would describe it. If you could just tell us in a nutshell, well, as big a nutshell as you like, what your work is about and how you come to be doing it.
Thank you, Rachel. Hello, everybody. And thank you so much, Rachel, for inviting me onto the session this evening and setting it all up and hosting it. So I think the work that I do really is very, very traditional and very simple, and it's work that we find being done all over the world, all over the planet, really from time immemorial. I don't know when we stopped doing it in this country, but I suspect relatively recently. I think by observation, we've had, we're told 6,500 years of sustainable agriculture in Europe, and just 100 years of what we might consider malpractice in our stewardship. And I think in context, as you've heard me open these chats before, Rachel, I think good to just 3 steps back and consider our paradigm of land stewardship, quite distinct and separate from specific practices and techniques and cropping rotation and details of the work. But at a paradigmatic level, 2 things that seem apparent to me with sustainable versus non-sustainable land stewardship practices. The first of which is our relationship with time. And historically, and for those of us directly involved in agriculture, we mostly live in circular time. And so a bit like that lovely movie Groundhog Day, where the character gets caught in an infinite time loop and wakes up and it's the same day every day, and he has to keep on living the same day till he gets the hang of it, and then he's released from his timeline once he's in a gray state. It's going to be spring every year, it's going to be autumn every year, we're going to plant and harvest every year. And so the art of cyclical time is to get better and better and more artful and more adept at our craft in what to do because we're going to do it again and again and again and again. Christmas comes every year. In Scotland, Hogmanay comes every year. But circular time, by its nature, puts us into present time and makes us pay very close attention to what we're doing now because we did it before and we'll do it again. And so we develop our arts and our crafts, and we're very focused in the present moment. Our culture, becoming industrial, post-industrial, and economically driven, we've adopted a consciousness of linear time, where we believe that whatever we truly want is not here now, but is there and then. And so we experience time as a ribbon going on ahead of us, and more power, more money, more sex, more cows, more whatever it is we want is down the line, and what we want to do is hasten towards it at a full gallop and leave the present behind. And literally our country's economic health is measured on its rate of growth. And so we worry if there's only single digits of economic growth and get excited if we've got double digits of economic growth, and we suffer under the delusion that this can continue indefinitely. And something that continues to grow exponentially and forever, in my medical training, the word for that was cancer. And so if we are in linear time and focused on perpetual growth, we literally then precipitate ourselves simply from a paradigm into a cancerous relationship with the landscape. So that's one thing I think that's important for us just to clock in terms of what's the difference between sustainable, non-sustainable. So circular time puts us into present moment, linear time takes us out of present moment. And then the second thing is we see very clearly that sustainable cultures have an awareness of and a profound interaction with the literal interactive and cooperative sentience, consciousness, and intelligence of everything in the landscape, not just at a conceptual level or a philosophical level, but a real everyday level. And we know all cultures historically have arts of managing their weather. We know from Dr. Emoto's work and various stories relating that our thoughts and projected feelings have a profound impact on the quality of water. And in my experience, also in the volume and standing height of water, both in rivers and springs and wells. We recognize by engaging love and interaction with plants that we can stimulate and enhance germination rates, health and vitality of the crop, storage capacity and nutritional quality of the crop. Similarly with animals, the animals that we talk to tend to thrive and weight gain better, are more adapted to the landscape that they live in, naturally balance their fertility cycles to an anticipated level of available forage through the season. And we can impact by direct communications and conversations which crop is preferred, which crop is supported by naturally predatory insects, against aphids, against insects, locusts, etc. So far beyond the sort of philosophical notion, once we get into it seriously, we find that landscape is fully intelligent, not just in a self-organizing way, but in an interactive and cooperative way. And when we engage with it, when we communicate clearly our needs and intentions, and when we listen deeply and carefully and quietly and peacefully and patiently, it tells us what it needs from us for optimum success in cooperative endeavor. So paradigmatically, those two things, regardless of our actual farming practice, which of course varies depending on soil and climate and economic imperatives, the real issue, I think, at a paradigmatic level is circular time and fully engaging with the conversation, with place as a collective consciousness, and then spirit of the farm, spirit of the field, spirit of the soil, spirit of the crops, the water, the weather, etc. And this is a universal tradition. There's simply nowhere on the planet that you can go where this either hasn't been done historically or is not in fact currently being practiced now. And our seasonal cycle of festivals really are our sort of main moments of seasonal attunement. Are in this country our solstices and equinoxes, and the movable feasts of the cross-quarter days. In the Celtic tradition, the Samhain and Imbolc, Lugnasad and Beltane. Those are times when we very consciously connect with landscape, speak with the Divic, nature spirit and elemental beings, align ourselves with them and allow them to align their selves with us. And those celebrations obviously been picked up and carried on in our Christian tradition, and I think are present in every tradition around the world. So we're really talking about something that's the most natural thing of all for us to do. It's simple. Our ancestors did it, whatever color our skin is, wherever part of the world we may originate from. And so we're really talking about a remembering of something that perhaps is actually at the very heart and center of all agricultural practice.
I'm really interested, Patrick, in how. So we have forgotten something that feels like it was a kind of sacred task, if you like. How do you go about that task? You know, how what does that conversation look like for you or feel like? So a lot of us probably perhaps celebrate those festivals, those pagan, the Celtic festivals, but there seems to be something missing in our understanding of what we should be doing at those. How does that look like for you?
So my experience is that the conversation happens in the imaginal space. And one of the things I think that has cut us off from this is a narrative that our imagination is a place of abstract fantasy. We don't believe that. That's just your imagination. In fact, for the shamanic practitioner, for the psychic, for the telepath, for the person who would communicate with other species and indeed with each other in a telepathic way, the imagination is the organ of psyche where this occurs. And so part of returning to this is to reclaim the sovereignty and power of our imagination. And we know that the imagination is where all inspiration comes in, whether that's musical or artistic, whether that's problem solving. We sleep on a problem, we wake up with fresh ideas. Maybe they come in a dream, maybe they come in a quiet moment. Maybe they come because a book jumps off the shelf and lands open at the right page. Maybe it comes in a conversation that we have randomly or something we hear on the radio. So, but the imaginal reality is the space, and I think literally is an organ of the psyche, just the same as heart and lungs and liver. And its nature is to perceive the patterns of spirit and to, by exchange, place pattern into spirit. So the cascade from pure unpatterned energy down into circumstantial reality passes through the pattern space. So we can think a bit like an architect drawing lines on a page, and at that point we can draw the line differently, we can rub it out, we can move the door with the window. Once we've got the pattern established that we want, then we pass that on to the builder, the carpenter, the bricklayer, and they make that manifest. And that's the same thing that's happening, I think, in an energetic way. Pure source energy comes to us. Our imagination is responsible for perceiving, adapting, creating pattern that then inevitably becomes circumstantial reality, just unavoidably as a consequence of how our reality is patterned and formed around us. So I think that's generically what's happening. And then in terms of how we individually experience that, some people's imaginal space works in a primarily visual way. The inner vision, the pictures that form in the mind. For some people, it's more an auditory, as though we're having a conversation in our head with other consciousnesses. For some people, it's more embodied, a clairsentience, where we feel, and certainly the gut instinct, I think, is central to that. And then there's claircognizance, where we simply know the answer, or have a deep knowing that just arises when we place our mind towards any particular issue or circumstance. So it can be multisensory, it can be single sensory, really just depending on our own personalities or circumstances of the day. Some people very olfactory, and literally will read a thing by sniffing it out. So there's no one way to do it. And I think just by applying our mind and engaging with a conversation, uh, and see how it goes for us individually. And it's very much a dialogue. So we hold a deep, quiet space. With this work, we always want to start by getting into a very clear, present, peaceful space so that our mind chatter falls away. And then we want to move our mind from executive consciousness, which is a very body linear mind, into observer consciousness, which is our soul mind, the eternal part of ourself that's naturally connected with all that is. So we move ourselves into a very peaceful space, into a very heart-centered space, into a space of love and gratitude. And then we tune our internal radio, as it were, simply by thinking clearly and specifically of whatever it is with which we need to speak, whether that's our farm entirely, or one particular field, or the tomatoes in the greenhouse, or the barley or the alfalfa. So we automatically phase in train or come into resonance with whatever we hold in mind. And then we pause there until we feel a heart-centered, loving, gratitudinal rapport establishing. And then once that's established, then we can go ahead and have dialogue with whatever it is that we're holding in mind.
So, what kind of thing comes up in that dialogue then, Patrick? I'm imagining that you talk about kind of us being in charge of rearranging the architecture of the patterns. I love that idea of patterns. You know, presumably there's also patterns that are coming up from whatever you're conversing with. Where does the agency lie? You know, what kind of conversation can be had? What kind of changes can be made in those
Yes.
conversations?
Well, lots of stories about what can occur. Um, one very simple, lovely story. A student of mine, apple grower in New South Wales, small family orchard, and when she came on my 3-day level 1 workshop, same as we'll be running together in October, she'd already learned to manage the weather, and she'd been taught by another farmer who'd spent a long time working on this, to call on Archangel Michael and the Ministry of Angels to put a weather bubble over her farm any time that she saw hail coming, either on the weather radar or or literally on the horizon. And their farm was at a scale where they didn't have hail nets. Their neighbors, bigger operators, had nets over the whole apple crop to keep hail off. But she learned to put this weather bubble up, and she actually had to adapt it, because when she put it up first, she was a bit too fierce with it, and it was keeping the rain out, and not just the hail. But she adapted the mesh size, as it were, a bit like Gore-Tex, to let moisture through, but rain, well, in this case, hail out. And she was literally able to keep hail off her farm, whilst her immediate neighbors on both sides had hail of such intensity that their hail nets were brought down and collapsed. So she'd already found a way to communicate in that regard with the angelic realms. And so in that regard, agency was her free will expressed as a human being, directed towards the angelic, with request that they intervene on her behalf with the elemental consciousness of the weather. So she came and went through the workshop, and learned different techniques, and direct telepathy, use of dowsing, use of kinesiology. And she went home and got into deep conversation with her apple trees, and in service to them, how much and when did they need watering, how much and when did they need compost, biodynamic preparations, foliar sprays, other nutrients. And this was all going great. And then it occurred to her that she could have a chat about the ripening of the apples. And as we know, an apple is only an apple in a supermarket. It is exactly the right size and shape. And so in order to harvest for supermarkets, she was having to go through the orchard 3 times in a harvest season, picking at supermarket defined specifications. And it's natural for an apple tree to want to spread its harvest, because that extends the opportunity for wildlife to pick up the fruit and move it around and seed in many directions. So in its natural form, an apple will definitely want to spread its harvest out as much as possible. However, she had this chat, and bless their hearts, the apple trees were able to bring I think she said about 98.5% of the harvest to supermarket spec ripening all at one time. And so she only had to harvest once through the whole orchard instead of 3 times, with obvious benefit in terms of convenience, efficiency, and labor costs. So, and many more stories, and I'm happy, we can talk lots of them, but that's rather a nice, simple, elegant one. And so we're left with an understanding that she was talking to them in her head, but our thoughts are vibrational electromagnetic waves that extend actually around the planet, on the standing wave of the Schumann resonance. And the common wild tongue is that universal language of vibrational speech. So we're left with an unavoidable conclusion that even though this was an imaginal conversation, the apple trees heard her, understood her, had capacity to adapt their growth and maturation, and chose to do so. and we're just left sort of trembling in awe at the grace by which we live, the generosity of the plants that are our food and their capacity to support us when sympathetically, lovingly, and in a service attitude communicated with.
Thank you. And so Patrick and I have just come from the Oxford Real Farming Conference, and I know there are a lot of farmers and land stewards there that are starting to kind of become aware or remember this kind of way of working with their land. So I can kind of attest that there are a lot of other stories that I've heard from Patrick's work and from other places as well. So I mean, it's mind blowing, really, and yet very obvious. It feels like I have always felt that there is a common wild tongue, that land, that nature speaks, that somehow we have forgotten and excluded ourselves from by our very complex use of human to human language. So I love this idea of this simplicity of somehow being able to reconnect with it and remember it. Something that I always wonder, Patrick, and you talked about malpractice, sustainable practice versus malpractice. So we have not been participating in the common wild tongue for these however many years, hundreds of years. What do you think the consequences are? It feels like surely there's a build-up of kind of frustration almost, if we can personify it, in the natural world, that the humans just aren't participating anymore. What's your feeling about that?
So at risk of telling the same stories again, but maybe with a fresh audience, it's fair if I can share the story of Alfalfa and the bloating cows. And so in brief, this is a story from Gloucestershire, a small organic dairy, award-winning cheesemakers with a shop in town. So they have only 20 cows milked once a day, and they survive very nicely on the value add of retailing their cheese. And they asked me to help with a situation they had. They had two fields of alfalfa that were not left over, deliberately held back to be last green forage in this particular year before going on to dry feed for the winter. And the alfalfa, two literally parallel fields separated by a stone wall, planted same day, same seed, same operator. And high density grazing practices, narrow strips. Cattle had grazed off the first in good shape, no worries, went into the second field. And within hours on the first strip, 7 out of 20 of them were showing signs of bloat, which those of you involved in livestock management will know is literally a deadly disease, deadly condition where indigestible food builds up gas in the rumen, and the cows literally expand and explode and die very unpleasantly from that. And alfalfa is notorious for doing this. So farmers are always extremely attentive to cows on alfalfa. So the farmer there spotted what was happening, pulled them out the field, drenched them with vegetable oil. No cows died. But then he was looking at a literally indigestible field that was supposed to be his last green forage, and a big hole in his forage budget if he couldn't use this. So he asked me to come, and I was nearby and sat down and had a meditation in the field, and into the imaginal space, invited all agencies, which in my mind, the intelligence or spirit of the farm entirely, the intelligence or spirit of that field, of the soils, and the gnome keepers of the soils, the spirit of the alfalfa and its fairy, its devic companion, spirit of the cows, spirit of the herd, and the goddess Bridget, who's the celestial civil servant responsible for all domesticated kine. And absolute chaos. And it became apparent with the conversation that arose round circle that the first field fully understood in its identity that it was part of an agricultural rotational cycle, that its purpose in planting was to sustain cows, to make milk, to make cheese, to feed people, and that it would then be replanted in due course, seed saved, in order that this would happen again. The second field did not have that clear identity. It hadn't been communicated with, and it didn't understand what was going on. And so it thought it was a wild field, and it thought that the cows were wild predators. And as many of you will know, plants have primary metabolites, which are the compounds, cellulose, lignin, etc., that they build themselves with, root, shoot, and leaf. But then they've also got a secondary metabolite system, which is a catalog of rapid response phenols, tannins, other chemicals that they mobilize in order to ward off predators, whether that's an aphid or a beetle or a locust or indeed a cow. And South African agronomists shared with me once that giraffe have to literally stalk acacia trees from downwind and get a nibble in, because once the tree recognizes that it's being browsed by giraffes, it almost instantly fills its leaves with tannins, which make it both indigestible and disgusting to a giraffe. And because of the way that plants communicate between themselves, it tells all its friends and neighbors in the patch of acacia that it's in. And so game over for giraffe, and then they got to go and stalk second breakfast somewhere else. And a ground cherry in the northwest of America, similar, sweet and delicious beyond belief, but once it smells or hears a person creeping up on it, it is able to render itself absolutely sour and disgusting. And so literally people have learned to creep up on it from downwind and harvest it before it realizes what's happening. So in this case, the alfalfa had deliberately rendered itself lethally toxic in order to defend itself in the way that it thought most appropriate. So internal conversation, imaginal conversation with all of these agencies explaining circumstance with love and with gratitude, requesting that this field of alfalfa allow itself, as the first one had, to become, in fact, nutritionally beneficial and wholesome to these cows. So this conversation happens literally at the speed of thought. And so the actual imaginal conversation took less time than it takes me to tell this story. Maybe it's a 90-second process once you're plugged in and connected. So it got the message, and it smiled and rolled over and said, yes, we're happy with that. Didn't know, didn't realize, nobody told us. Got the message, good to go. So we waited 12 hours. The cows went back into the field, and indeed they were able to then graze the entire rest of the field over the subsequent days following, with no further ill health or consequence. And so, again, just like the apple trees, our conclusion is I had effectively an imaginal conversation, but apparently the plants heard it, the plants understood it. They had agency to adapt, literally, their metabolic physiological expression, and chose to do so. And so on from there, then, I think if we don't have that conversation with the landscape, and very few farmers now are doing this, our plants don't understand what's happening. They don't recognize the identity, they don't recognize the role, they don't feel the love of the farmer. They don't therefore have capacity to adapt and accommodate us. And I believe that this is literally meaning that we are ingesting lethally toxic food. And my hair is gray enough to remember a time when food allergies were almost unheard of. I went to a high school with 2,000 kids. I think there might have been one person with a peanut allergy. And now the degree of intolerance to food is extraordinary, because I think if there's one defining feature of a human being, it's that we've got a multi-fuel furnace. And that's what's allowed us to spread across the entire planet and have an incredibly wide variety of diets, whether we're on whales in the Arctic or coconuts in the tropics. The sort of defining feature of a human being is we can eat pretty much anything. And now the reactions to food and the illnesses that food is creating is literally spectacular, particularly, to me, growing up with healthcare and training in healthcare. So I think, in very simplistic terms, if we don't talk to our plants and they don't know what's going on, they deliberately mobilize secondary metabolites to defend themselves, and we're left with a food chain of deliberately lethally toxic substance. So it's not trivial, this thing. I mean, that's, sort of sounding a warning drum, and I don't like to get too heavy or alarmist, but I think we have to, call a spade a spade. It's not just for tree huggers. I think if your role and responsibility as a farmer is to feed your community, and what's actually coming off your farm is lethally toxic, then that's a serious problem, and I would consider that malpractice. Sorry, I'm using slightly pejorative and heavy terms, but we've got a short time to get an important message across here, Rachel. So I am deliberately using slightly dramatic and provocative language here, but I think, the point is very clear from this. But beyond that, crops that I've worked with, one classic 2 years in a row farm here in Perthshire, near where I'm speaking from. 2 years in a row, their agronomist showed up and said, "You've got the best field of carrots in central Scotland." And then, of course, the next words out of his mouth was, "We'd better spray them," just to make sure they stay good. There was no question of what had happened for this field to be the best field of carrots in central Scotland. And fields where there is no need to use pesticides, because once the field knows the preferred crop and is loved and talked to, it naturally brings in the spiders, the wasps that eat up the aphids, and natural pest control is just part of 6,500 years of sustainable farming. So the consequences of this are huge in terms of ease and efficiency of management, as well as the nutritional quality of the food that we're sending off farm for people to eat.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'd like to open up to questions in a minute. So if you have a question, please could you raise your hand electronically or put it in the chat if that's easier, and I'll try and look at the chat as well. But I'm just thinking, just while we're waiting for that, Patrick, I'm just kind of the ramifications of what this means for all kinds of natural systems. So we're talking specifically about farms here, because that's where most of your work is, but kind of wild nature, the conversations that we don't have, the amount we could learn from having these conversations on a regular basis. My last question is, I guess, is this something we can all do? I mean, you're a third generation psychic healing art person. Is this something that we're all born with and then we've shut off, or is this something that takes a lot of kind of training? And where do you stand on that?
I think it's the most natural thing of all. And I think I was just lucky to grow up in a family where it was ordinary and normal, and so nobody told me not to. I think, children naturally talk to the fairies in the garden, and they'll continue to do that for the whole of their lives, unless some adult in authority, whether a parent or a teacher or somebody else, tells them that that's just their imagination, and that's not real. And so they're either shamed or humiliated or discarded, because that's not gonna, get them whatever they're looking for in school, for so-called education. So I think I was just lucky because there was a family tradition. We just did what was natural and thought that was normal. And the challenge for me has been to move in a world where apparently uh, that's not currently normal or natural. But I don't think there's any special gift. I don't think there's any special tool or technique. It's literally what we observe children to do left to themselves. And if we allow that reality to be honored, respected, cultivated, supported, and put to use, then job's a good one, I think.
So where do we start, all of us, tonight, tomorrow? What would you recommend as the one kind of...
Yes. Well, I think just allow yourself to hold that what happens in your imagination is real, and just start having conversations in that way. Um, Mostly, I think what we find is e- evidence of the communication happens when we're communicating a real need. So when there's real need is when we're focused, we're reaching out, we need help, and either because there's no other thing to do but pray, as it were, or because it's smart to pray as well as pray and spray, but at least pray. If you have to spray, pray as well, as it were. Um, but just allowing the possibility that the plants can hear us, the soil can hear us, the animals can hear us, and engaging as though that were true, and particularly applying it in circumstances of need, and then observing what happens as a consequence of that. And I think we don't want to go into this with blind faith. I think if it works, then we'll know it, and we'll see it, and we'll find out. And so the journey sort of starts of, can I do it? And then the next part of the journey is, oh my goodness, that worked. And then the next part of the journey is, how can I do that better? Um, what conversations to have with cropping, for example. I find that the most important conversation to have is pre-planting, blessing the seed, and communicating with the field before planting. That's our sort of, you can talk to the crop at any point, but the pattern is kind of set at uh, at the point of germination. So in terms of cultivating the art of it, um, and typically, cropping clients will send me a planting map in advance of planting so that I can support them or on their behalf have those conversations of attunement in advance. So definitely, as we go, we learn the art and craft. And again, I think that's why our seasonal cycle festivals were timed as they are, because those are the solstices and equinoxes are actually midpoints. And the cross-quarter days are threshold seasonal change points. So that's telling us when it's most important to have the conversation. And then what conversation to have is obviously completely unique to our practices and our farm on that season. So I think just go ahead and start, and have an open mind. Um, Honor and trust and respect what comes into the imagination. Make sure it's dialogue, and that we listen deeply and hold space in our imagination to perceive what information comes back, what thoughts the field puts into our head, what visions come, and then our job is to take action based on inspiration.
Great, thank you. So I'd love to get some voices in here. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand. There's a one from Florence here, which I think is a big one that we're probably all from time to time asking ourselves. This link between our disconnection, this lack of conversation, and the climate and ecological crisis. I mean, that feels like a no-brainer almost. What's your view on that, Patrick?
Yes, thank you. Very central question. And again, forgive me if I become dramatic and alarming in my response. We are speaking this common wild tongue all the time, whether we know it or not. And the disconnection is on our end, not on theirs. So they hear what we're saying, we just aren't listening to their response. And when we apply collective intention towards an outcome, then we get exponential results. So in terms of weather, and I've had circumstances where farmers have measured rainfall, over 18-month periods. And in Australia, they want more rain. And we had a farm where we got on each of 17 rain events, more rain on this farm than on immediate neighbor farms, and 3 rain events where it rained only on our farm because we were talking to the weather. Now, farmers are often reluctant to do this because they believe that rain is finite, at least in Australia, and if they get good, then their neighbors are not. But it's a cyclical system, and if we draw out of one end, it fills up at the other end. Equally, farmers in Vermont, they put a weather bubble up to stop it raining for 2 weeks while they get hay in. And I've got farmers who can literally put up a weather bubble and watch rainstorms split, go around them, and join up again on the other side of the farm, and no rain falls for 2 weeks. And then once the hay's in, they take the weather bubble down. So, but this happens at a collective level. So if, for example, we've got 60 million people in the UK, 400 million people in the US, and our weather person is telling us that we're in drought, for example, that then becomes 460 million people adding collective consciousness to drought. And the elementals hear us, and they oblige and provide the drought that we're intending. And catastrophic climate events, if we're told to expect that, and we all put that thought out, lo and behold, our prayers are answered, because human beings have agency of free will, and the elementals, as we've been describing, do respond to this. So the same as growing food, we have a very serious collective responsibility in terms of what we communicate and what we invite and what we affirm and assert. And so if instead the weather person said, looks like we're heading into drought conditions, let's all pray for perfectly balanced weather, then let's see what happens then. And whether or not, in fact, the weather beings will adapt and accommodate to our thoughts and intentions, which in my experience, they do. So I think there's lots of aspects, obviously, to our climate conversations, and certainly, central to regenerative agricultural practices is sequestration of carbon, and with that buffering of moisture conditions and buffering of the highs and lows of hot and cold. But again, I think every shamanic culture works with weather. The Dalai Lama historically has a weather manager on staff. It's just always a thing that we do. Indigenous cultures would think we're absolutely barn door crazy not to sing to our cattle, talk to our crops, and be in close communication with the weather. And sailors have done this forever. Whistling for wind. I've got sailing friends who sail terrifyingly small boats over large expanses of deep water, and they don't go until they get a thumbs up from the weather divas. And if they do get a thumbs up from the weather divas, then they know it's safe to go. So I think, again, we've got to really take this on board, that the contract that we have as human beings with free will is that our thoughts and requests are fulfilled and manifest. And so we should be very conscious of this, I think. And the more we believe and buy into the narrative of catastrophic climate change that we're told never happened before, even though I lived for 8 months in the Orkney Islands, and it was warmer then in the Bronze Age than it is now, and there's still plants and crops. Most of what's now deserted moorland in Scotland went under intense agricultural production in the Bronze Age. So circular time, this has happened many times before. And the difference is our conversation, I think, with the weather, with the climate, and through that, then our ability both to moderate it, modulate it, and creatively adapt to it.
Great, thank you, Patrick. We've got 8 minutes. I've got Natalie, Peter, and a great question from Daisy down here as well. So should we see if we can get those in? So Natalie, what's your question, please? Do you want to unmute there? Brilliant.
Thank you. So I grow a garden every year, and I have very good fortune with it. My problem is recurring woodchucks, and this is for years and years and years. I have relocated them. I don't want to hurt them. I've come to really respect them. And my garden is fenced. It doesn't matter. They dig under. So what would be a way that I could honor their woodchuckness and, you know, the knowledge that they're just doing what they're doing to eat and, you know, all of that. But at the same time, they don't offer to water or weed, so they're not pulling their own weight, but they're eating my stuff. Do you have any? They're smarter than me. I've come to accept that, but still, it's a lot of work to just feed these little guys. So how could I approach them with these techniques?
Should we take Peter's question as well, Patrick, so that you can answer them both together? I'm just thinking in the interest of time here. So let's hold the woodchucks. I think that's a really important one. Peter, do you want to unmute and ask your question, and then Patrick can answer both?
Okay, yeah. My question is very much connected with this larger picture as well. I work and live within a community. And here in the mountains, there's a very old tradition of agriculture in the north of Italy, where there are well-formed terraces, and I feel an incredible sadness in the landscape. And the water, the streams of the mountain have all been captured and put into a concrete box where they take the water and then sell it back to the public. And most of the landscape, I manage a fairly extensive piece of land within this community. But I feel that there's this irritation or this discomfort from the beings that live there, and I don't have much control over the engineers or the people who govern this land. You know, like I'm basically the only person who knows anything about the land, and the rest of the people are sort of meditating most of the time. Should I just pull back, you know, sort of reduce my area of sort of action and sort of stay with the general landscape, but just sort of like, I've had a message of just sort of like not planting food anymore, like this year. And I sort of say, oh, that's sort of, for me, that's counterproductive. But I'm sort of a little bit confused within myself, you know, from what you've said. I'll go back and talk more openly a bit more, but I feel that there's forces that are out of my control. You know, there's sort of engineers that I don't have the chance of talking to, and the person who employs the engineers who are catching all the water and putting it in tubes and taking it off the landscape. while I'm trying to do exactly the opposite. I can't find a middle path. So I sort of thinking maybe I should just reduce into my own small backyard and just try and, I don't know, it's complex, a bit like this world thing of where the human beings have one mindset, and unless we wake up to the power of our responsibility. Anyway, it's along those lines.
So the woodchucks as well, Patrick,
Yes.
took some responsibility.
So thank you both. Great questions. So the elementals and nature spirits, I think, are governed by devas, fairy, however we language them, and we communicate with them regarding weather, soil, plant, and animal. And then the angelic community, I think, are our human upline. And so when I'm working with farmscapes, we identify and connect both with an overall farm diva who's offering itself as representative for dialogue with all things nature, spirit, and elemental, but then also a farm angel who holds the collective consciousness of human action and relationship on the farm. So, Peter, I'm thinking to include your communications with the governing collective intelligence held by the angelic, which may then indeed have influence and impact on decisions, sometimes miraculously, in fact, in terms of what decisions and attitudes are held both by individual and collective human agencies. So I would chat both to your divas and the overlighting angel of the community, and try and find the celestial civil servant who will whisper into the ears of the engineers and maybe create some kind of change in attitude with that. With pests and predators and yes, woodchucks. I in Vermont, I have a woodchuck lives under one of my sheds, and to my great horror, on one occasion, trying to trap it, managed to trap a skunk instead, and that was a very bad moment. Um, uh, that was a very bad and disappointed moment, and I gave up after that and let him be. So. So we can communicate directly with the animals, and there's two ways to go. One is we create a definitive zone of exclusion, and if they transgress that, then you've got to kill because they're hungry and they've got families to feed. But if you in your mind declare a psychic boundary and there can be no woodchuck in here, otherwise we're just going to shoot you. And if you do that, you've absolutely got to follow through. But you don't need generally to kill more than once, because they get the message and they get that you're serious. Outside of that, and preferable if it's possible, which is to clearly communicate how much they can take. And you guys can take 10% and we're all good, or 20% or such. Even with some clients, we get into deliberately planting sacrifice areas of whatever they really like to eat and just let them clearly know, this is for you. This is mine. Leave that alone. All of this is yours. Go hog wild with it. And that's generally a preferable way to go. Sometimes you really do need an exclusion. You don't want poisonous snakes in your house. You don't want scorpions in your house. You don't want, wolves in around your lambs, etc. So sometimes it is appropriate to do just absolute 100% exclusion or kill, and you've got to be really ruthless and follow through with a kill, and they'll get the message and leave it alone. But if it's possible, I think preferable either to just let them know how much they can take, and that's all good. And I think that's what tithing originally was. That's the 10%. is what we leave for wildlife in an agricultural crop, because otherwise we're in competition with wildlife on landscape, and that's a big conversation now, agroecology versus farming versus rewilding. We share a landscape, so we got to manage the landscape so that all in the landscape can be healthy and happy. And one of our friends literally, if there's TB around, feeds his badgers molasses, because TB is basically a disease of malnutrition. And so he feeds his badgers molasses so they stay healthy and don't get TB, and then his cattle are in good shape. Other situations, a sacrifice paddock, Alstroemeria growers in Tasmania, they had an aphid problem. We just planted a whole raft of Alstroemeria outside the greenhouse. You guys can, that's all for you. Don't come in the greenhouse. We need these ones for our production. So that's your two basic strategies. Obviously preferable to plant and share, plant more than you need. It's hard with woodchucks in the garden because they're a bit voracious, but if you plant for them outside of your fenced area, plant the woodchuck garden and plant the people garden, or whatever comparable is with the crops you're managing. That generally is pretty good way to go.
I'll try that. I can't kill them, but I'll try that.
Sounds like your only way to go then.
Yes, it is.
Skunks if you try and trap them.
Well, I've done that, but there's always another one. You know, it's a never-ending supply of woodchucks.
Brilliant. We're going to have to leave it there, folks, I'm afraid. I'm so sorry, Patrick. There's a question that I'm dying to ask you, and we've just run over time. Maybe if you could answer this as a one word, a yes or a no, even, Patrick, and it can be a be continued. Daisy is asking if plants ever say no. You can use one sentence rather than just a yes or no. Oh.
Depends on the degree of diplomacy.
Okay. Brilliant. And the rest of that we can leave to our imaginations. Thank you so much, Patrick, for coming. Thank you all for joining us for this hour. Just to say that Patrick is coming to the UK to teach in October. We will send details of that tomorrow when we send out the recording. So if you're interested to hear more, that would be a brilliant way to do it. So thank you. It's been fantastic. Max said actually in the chat that we need a revolution for this kind of thinking to become mainstream. And I think that's what we're about, isn't it? Bringing on the revolution.
Revolving in circular time.
Yes, brilliant. All right. Thanks ever so much, Patrick. Thanks, everyone. Good night. See you soon.